Good morning, everybody, and we're about to start our session on cybersecurity, risk and opportunity. How do we get the cyber balance right? It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. My name is Rosemary Sinclair, and I'm the CEO of auDA. Who is responsible for administering Australia's internet domain, better known as the .au, at the end of your email address and at the end of Australian web addresses. Interesting factoid, we process every day 3 billion messages, people looking for websites or sending emails. So as we all know, and if we didn't, we've certainly learnt over the last 15 months, life on the internet is very busy, but very important to everything that we're doing. And in that, of course, cybersecurity is at the forefront of our minds every day. So I'm really pleased to be facilitating this session on risk and opportunity, getting that cyber balance right. For our discussion today, we have 3 guests bringing different perspectives: government, industry, and then the research and innovation perspective. So from the government, we're very honoured to have the Honourable Karen Andrews, MP, Minister for Home Affairs. The Minister has represented constituents of Macpherson in Queensland since 2010 and has served in a number of ministerial roles since 2014. Taking on the Home Affairs portfolio in March this year, we welcome her fresh perspective today on all things cybersecurity. Secondly, on the panel is Keith Howard. Keith is the Chief Information Security Officer at the Commonwealth Bank and leads the Cyber Division at CommBank and Bank West, holding the great responsibility, as all of us know, of keeping customer information safe and secure. And thirdly, we have joining us virtually Michelle Price, the CEO of AustCyber. Michelle joined AustCyber in January 2017, being appointed CEO in 2018, where she works to grow Australia's cybersecurity ecosystem, the opportunity side of this equation, and to establish Australia as a leading centre for cyber education and to assist in the export of Australia's cyber capabilities to the world. So welcome to all our panellists, and thank you very much for joining us. Before I launch into my short notes, let me remind all the panellists, all the attendees rather, that you can post questions to the panellists via the conference app or the portal on your screens, and vote on the questions of others so that we're asking the questions that matter most. There's also a poll on the conference app that you can vote on. The poll question is: what has been the greatest driver of increased cyber literacy within organisations? We'll come back to that later, but first our discussion. Today, as we know, much of our day-to-day business interactions and social engagement is conducted online. We know that cybersecurity is critically important to ensure the privacy of our information and intellectual property, and to ensure our businesses and social activities are not interrupted by bad actors with bad intentions. I'd ask you now to pause and cast your mind back to 15 years ago. It seems a very long way. Think about the way you conducted your business and social life in the mid-2000s. Corporations were doing away with typing pools and offices were becoming far more connected. Facebook was 2 years old. Twitter was 2 months old. Instagram and TikTok did not even exist. But as personal and business information moved online, and our businesses grew more connected, so too did identity and intellectual property theft increase. Since that time, and as our economy has become increasingly interconnected, cyber criminals have become only more sophisticated. At auDA, we know this all too well. We monitor online trends very closely, including business registrations and cyber threats. Over the last 15 months, we have seen an incredible surge in businesses moving online as their face-to-face opportunities were restricted. Total .au domains registered with auDA in that time grew by nearly 160,000. Indeed, COVID was the crisis that we did not wish to have, but it has been a catalyst for great digital transformation. The flip side to this, however, is that we have also seen an increase in online crime. The ACSC's annual report highlighted that a cybercrime is reported every 10 minutes. And that's why cybersecurity is such a critical issue for us all. The decentralised and distributed nature of the internet, of course, means cyber threats here may come from elsewhere, and that information created here may be stored on servers overseas or digitally transmitted across multiple borders at once. So we're in an international dimension with this issue. The reality is the threat posed from cybercrime is not unique to any one business or any one nation. Managing it well will take a sustained and multi-stakeholder effort. As a starting point, we're pleased to see cybersecurity as a key topic of conversation in boardrooms and in cabinet meetings across the country. We also want to see Australian businesses, governments and law enforcement work together to combat the risks and to seize the opportunities presented by this growing field of cybersecurity. And indeed, I'm going to ask the Minister if she might share with us a little insight into the Ironside effort, which was exactly an example of that cooperation internationally. We're heading down the right track, and I'm personally looking forward to many more productive conversations about how all this can progress. So let's start right here today with this panel. I'll come over and take my seat at the panel and ask the Minister the first question. I think, and particularly given the response and adjustment that we've made to the conference because of COVID, it's a reality that we need to reflect on the COVID experience. And throughout 2020, the internet has really become inextricably linked to what we know now as COVID normal, a phrase that we didn't even know 15 months ago. And whilst the COVID experience has driven home the importance of digitisation and connectivity, there have been, I think, a range of issues that we've seen from a cyber security point of view in this time as well. And I wondered, Minister, if you might like to comment on that from your perspective.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and to be part of this panel. And clearly in your introductory comments you focused on a wide range of issues, so I hope we have the opportunity to unpack a lot of that. Look, I think starting with COVID and the COVID environment is a very good place for us today. Clearly, 2020 was an unexpected year for many of us. Here in Australia, it clearly indicated that we have a lot of resilience, we have a lot of innovation, and we have the ability to adapt very quickly to a very quickly changing environment. Now, COVID changed fundamentally the way that we live and the way that we work. And I think it's very clear that Australians access to and use of technology, digital platforms is much greater as a result of COVID than it would have been if we hadn't had to deal with those particular sets of circumstances. What it has done is really provide us with a double-edged sword. The positive side of COVID is that we have increased our capacity. From an economic point of view, many of our businesses moved quickly to establish an online presence. As consumers, we moved from doing a lot of our shopping at retail outlets to moving online. So there were opportunities for those businesses who were able to move quickly to online or to increase their presence online to adapt to the changing economic environment in which they found themselves. That brings with it a number of issues. Firstly, it means that many of our small businesses, sometimes our niche businesses, our micro businesses, established an online presence but didn't understand the maintenance that was required to continue that online presence, and that will be an ongoing issue for them. It also meant that many individuals as well as businesses were working from a home environment. That started to compromise some of the systems because they weren't just using their devices that were clearly and easily linked into their workplace, they were using home devices, and the level of security on home devices, as many of us would recognise, is not where it should be. So it started to bring in a level of compromise at a much greater rate than we would have been expecting. It has also meant that there are risks with people having more opportunities to be online. Clearly, it means that if we look at terrorism-related issues, there are people that now have had significant amounts of time to be at home online, and we do know that that has led to an increase in radicalisation. I don't particularly want to go down that path today, but it has also meant that we have opened the opportunity for our cyber criminals. So we have seen increasing activity. As we rolled out the $1.67 billion cybersecurity strategy, one of the things that we are going to be very mindful of is the impacts of COVID and the fact that we are going to have to collaborate, work very closely with individuals and businesses so that we can actually fulfil our objectives for our economic recovery. So I might leave it at that point, and perhaps we could pick up some of those points in the discussion later.
Thank you, Minister. That's a very nice segue, perhaps to you, Keith. From an industry perspective, what have you seen through the COVID experience in terms of cybersecurity issues?
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks for inviting me here today to be part of this esteemed panel. I think some of it's already been covered. The big challenges, of course, was the shift online for businesses as they work through the COVID period, but also workforces also shifting to a work from home, or as it was more recently, hybrid, and then work from home and then hybrid, and we go through these kind of periods. That is at the same time that we're seeing an incredibly active threat landscape, in particular with regards to ransomware. I talk a lot about demystifying cyber, so please do stop me if I'm not demystifying it or I am mystifying it. But ransomware is basically where you download some malware either through a phishing email, and that basically encrypts your systems so you can't access your data. And usually it also involves your data being exfiltrated with a ransom being requested. That's a bit too polite, but a ransom being demanded. So the threat landscape certainly is incredibly active. We, I think, need to consider how we all work together in concert across government, across industry, across whatever the size of businesses, because no business is immune to these threats. The other thing about the threat landscape, I'd say, is we're seeing the threat actors combining and collaborating a lot more than they have previously. We're also seeing an improvement in stagecraft. So it really doesn't take long at all if a vulnerability is found for that to be weaponized and then that to be on-sold, and then that can be utilized very swiftly. So you've got to consider the pace in all of this as well, and I think you made an incredibly good point. If you think back 20 years, there was no Facebook, there was no iPhone, there was no... And things are moving at such a rate of knots. So I think those are the key things. I'd just like to say as well, no business is immune to this, as I said earlier on. And it's incumbent on us all, I think, to work together in a very collaborative way to be able to raise the cyber awareness across the community, across businesses, across individuals, so that we can all collectively get stronger.
Terrific. Thanks, Keith. And taking that point, Michelle, about the rapid nature of change to the threats, given your role in what I'm going to call cyber tech, we've been all talking about fintech for the last decade. I suspect we're going to be talking about cyber tech for the next decade. Could you give us your perspective on what's happening and our ability to respond with technology?
Absolutely, and good morning, everyone. I wish I could be there in person. The irony of this situation is that I live in Canberra and I'm coming to you from Sydney. Didn't quite make it out in time. So with all of the things that we need to do in business, I've decided to stay and let's see what happens with that. But absolutely, we have, of course, as the Minister has said and Keith said, seen a massive uptick in the use of digital products and services as a result of the environment that we find ourselves in. But also the increase in the risk. Now, the nexus in between those two is opportunity. What I think that we can take, if there's anything that we can be grateful for over the past 18 months when it comes to the cyber domain, is that there has been a realisation, and I think now also an acceptance, that ransomware as one of the most sort of popular forms of malicious cyber attack, but really any kind of malicious cyber attack can affect anyone. Us in the biz have known this for decades. We've been kind of yelling at a brick wall about this for a long time. What COVID has done for us has proven that really it is not just about the opportunistic cyber criminals that will go after the smallest of businesses, including sole traders, as they try to digitise their businesses and still have a business during a pandemic, but also to have a coordinated effect across a whole series of small businesses. And let's not forget small agencies as well. We have 3 layers of government in this country. That, you know, when you sort of look at that mix, it can look like it was an opportunistic attack, but actually it's been yet another grab by a sophisticated syndicate or a nation state in laying through their foundations, their infrastructure to continue those attacks. So that might sound like the sky is falling for all of us, but actually the opportunity part is that absolutely we've also talked more and more about cyber tech, as Rosemary put it. Cyber tech, I think, is going to be a conversation that will hopefully embed, that it won't just be for the next decade, it will be for generations to come, because everything is cyber and everything cyber is physical. And so that opportunity side means that if we can impart the right kinds of cyber tech and the services that get wrapped around those into all organisations, whether they be public or private, we have a massive opportunity as we recover from the pandemic and take on this new world that we have by improving digital trust. And that's one of the points that I want to leave all of us with today, is that ultimately at the heart of what this is about is trust. And if we have increased digital trust as one of the outcomes from this intriguing state that we find ourselves in, then we're not going to sink or swim. And we'll be one of the trusted players in the cyber physical world to do business with, whether that's government or business, indeed, or for research. And, you know, the point that the Leader of the Opposition made in the last session around the role of research and how Australia isn't very good at commercialising research, I'm going to counter that. I think that what we are very, very good at doing is actually commercialising deep tech out of the research environment. We're perhaps not as good at doing it when it's not deep tech related. So that's perhaps where we could improve. But there are things like growth centres, which is what AustCyber is. We are the Cybersecurity Growth Centre. We're there to help make that happen. And we now have over 500 Australian cybersecurity companies producing cyber tech and services to help resolve this situation.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I think out of that, there's a key theme of awareness. And I just wanted to pick that issue up. We probably need to understand government awareness, which from where I sit is very high. But then also, Minister, if I could ask you, how aware do you think the business community is? And then to your earlier point about small business, jumping online, a great opportunity, some risks coming with that.
Look, I think it's fair to say that if you were to look across all of industry at what their level of cyber awareness was and is, it's very patchy. There are some businesses that do have a very well-developed understanding of the risk of a cyber attack. They're very aware of the need to make sure that they are protecting their own data, the data of their customers. But as I've just said, it is very, very patchy. And if you start to look at our small businesses in particular, I would say that the level of cyber awareness is too low, that we need to do all that we can from a government point of view, but also from our large businesses showing a leadership role as well to support through their supply chains our small and medium enterprises, but importantly our small enterprises, to make sure that they are protecting their data, that they have in place good cyber defences. So the awareness level is not there. It's not at a level that it should be at, and it is an area where there is considerable work yet to be done.
And that role of industry, I think, with the through the supply chain, Keith, is an area that takes me straight to you.
Yep, absolutely. So in terms of awareness, it's improving, I think. Cyber has gone from being, I think, not so interesting to people necessarily doing other parts of the business to being incredibly interesting right now, for sure, because of all the stuff we're seeing in the media. And I think that, therefore, is naturally making people more curious about it, which is great. We need to continue the demystification of it. Like when we look at small to medium enterprises, there are 3, 4 just very simple things that they can actually do to safeguard themselves, such as multi-factor authentication, such as having a strong password. So if you have a password of something like 8 characters, and it's just numbers and letters, and you capitalize them, capitalize 1 or 2 of them, that can be cracked in minutes or hours. I forget the precise statistics. If you move to a 14-character one, with the same kind of constituent elements to it, so it's just numbers and letters, not talking necessarily symbols, that increases the chances of somebody actually compromising that password to thousands of years. So the length is very important, making it a bit wacky. You're thinking of passphrases. Other things such as just backing up your data and making sure you keep that off of your network. These are actually quite simple steps that small businesses can actually take to improve the security posture. We do a lot of education with small businesses, our small business customers, which includes there's some materials on the website, includes some educational talks, it includes a quarterly kind of newsletter that I send out on the key themes, etc. And I think, again, it's incumbent on all of us to try and make that as simple and as engaging as possible so that people actually are not scared of the cyber kind of subject, but actually are able to engage in it.
Terrific. And coming out of that, Michelle, for you, using your considerable experience, what steps do you think we could take to coordinate efforts? And are there some technology solutions to this issue of raising awareness?
There are, and I'm really happy to say that lots of the options available in Australia are Australian born. One of the things that we know about the psychology of this is exactly the same as the psychology of any other risk area, whether that's workplace health and safety, food safety risk, all of those kinds of forms of risk that we've had the maturation process happen in the past, where we sort of figured out over time that we really did need to care about this en masse. The psychology is focused on word of mouth, and where you get your trusted information from, there's that word again. And so what we are finding is that if you are, for example, a small business that is using the Commonwealth Bank to provide your financial services, and that's combined with an ecosystem of, sort of the accountancy and bookkeeping type advice that you receive and the business analyst advice that you receive, as a small business owner, then that ecosystem that the CBA has is actually the best place for that small business to be getting that trusted information from. And so behind the scenes, there is a lot of coordination that goes on between large providers within the economy and organisations like AustCyber and many others to make sure that we have a baseline consistency in that messaging. The branding is obviously different. The angle is sometimes quite different depending on the industry, but that consistency of messaging needs to be there so that we can trust the information that's coming through in that. We know that government certainly has a huge role to play here, but it is often that government will be looked to as the trusted source of advice after an incident has occurred. And we see that frequently where cyber.gov.au, the use of that website spikes when there has been an incident that's been reported in the news and people want to understand whether or not it's going to impact them. So the prevention side, there's a huge onus on industry for that. And then in terms of the remediation side, there's a huge onus on government for that. But actually in the middle there, we need to be working together, as the Minister said, and also Keith pointed to this as well. I think the other thing too is that the language that we used, and Keith pointed twice now to demystifying cyber, I have found across all of the sectors that we've worked in at AustCyber, and that is every sector of the economy, we are often a bit of a go-to to try and translate what cyber risk means for individual organisations in any sector, any segment, is that they really do respond very positively when you are talking about it as cyber risk as opposed to cyber threat. The cyber threats most people see as the domain of a nation state, and that's reasonable because they can be incredibly complex and quite scary. When we're talking about cyber risk as it applies in the context of each individual organisation, that's when it starts to hit home. And if we think about how we do assign assumptions to different sectors, some sectors absolutely are more mature in their cyber risk posture than others, but we're now all intermingled because of the data that we're holding, exchanging, value adding on. And of course, the government's doing a huge amount of work around how we actually better orchestrate that through things like the consumer data right and the advent of a data strategy. And how we embed cybersecurity in that is going to be critical. And so the work, I guess, is a combined effort here, is around secure by design, which is exactly the same kind of mindset that we have as organisations, whether we're public or private, around safety by design. Now, safety by design, of course, has two meanings now, which is, of course, physical safety as well as digital safety. It's the same for cybersecurity as well.
Terrific. Thanks, Michelle. That's given us really a plethora of policy issues. So I'm going to ask the Minister in a moment to give us a big picture strategy, I think, around cyber security, cyber safety, international cyber affairs. Perhaps this might be the moment for a little insight into Ironside. And I'm just going to remind our audience, both in the room and online, that in a very few moments it will be your opportunity to ask some questions. So, Minister, that's a big question, I know, but I'm sure we'll get a very interesting answer.
Yes. Well, where to start? I might actually start by saying that I've had the opportunity to work with Michelle for a number of years now, and I've always found her insight into the cyber issues to be quite exceptional. So just listening to Michelle speak, she raised a number of things that I'd like to touch on in the course of speaking about the way forward for the federal government, and particularly from my portfolio. So effectively now I've been in the role of Minister for Home Affairs for the best part of 3 months. It's a huge portfolio, and I've had the opportunity now to start doing some deep dives into some of the issues there. Without taking you through that journey in detail, I think it's sufficient to say today that I have elevated cyber to the priority in the portfolio. And I have done that for a number of reasons. Firstly, we have the government strategy in place, the $1.67 billion cybersecurity strategy that we released in August of last year. We have already started to look at how we roll out. There is significantly more work to do. It has what I would call 3 pillars in it, which is government and its role. A key part of that is making sure that the government systems are secure and that we have in place the right cyber defences. The second pillar is industry, and I've touched on that a little bit today. I've already engaged a couple of times with the industry advisory group that was established and is chaired by Andy Penn about what the opportunities will be to engage with small, medium and our large businesses. I intend to work in those 3 areas, specifically with our large businesses by getting into the boardrooms as often as I can to make sure that businesses are at that scale are adopting a top-down approach. So I need to know what businesses, what their boards are doing at a very senior level to make sure that there is not only cyber awareness, but there are strategies in place to ensure that they have the proper defences in place. Our medium and our small enterprises I'll put together because they are quite difficult areas to raise awareness in. I've had some preliminary discussions with insurers and with the Insurance Council to look at what we can do to find an entry point, particularly for our small businesses, that will make them take cyber more seriously and for them to act. Now, what I've done with the insurers is spoken to them about the fact that they have, I'll call it a checklist. I'm sure insurers have a much more sophisticated name for it. But what checklist do they run through when they're talking to businesses about their physical security? How can they start to translate that to the digital, the online, the cyber security that businesses need to have in place? Because I am of the view that if we are going to encourage small businesses in particular to take the action that they need to take, we have to find an entry point, and one of those is dollars. So are these businesses going to be able to reduce their insurance premiums by putting in place certain measures? If so, what are those measures and how do they go about getting the information to put that in place? So businesses are the second part of our cyber security strategy. The third part is effectively our individuals, our community individuals. So we need to make sure that we are working with mums and dads at home with kids so that they understand the risks for them. Potentially the entry point to them is identity theft. So we are battling against a view from many Australians that's probably played out around the world that it's not going to happen to them. But we do know that there is an increasing frequency of identity theft, that data is being taken, alternate identities are being established, and people are going to have to go through a significant process to reverse that information. So they're the 3 main pillars of our cyber security strategy. Given the time, I might take that last point directly into just make a couple of comments about Operation Ironside. Now, that was formally disclosed only a couple of weeks ago, and I'd have to say I'm incredibly proud of the Australian Federal Police for the work that they have done. They worked hand in glove with the FBI to basically take out some of the big criminals around the world. They did that, and we provided a lot of tech support and a lot of development. They did that by establishing an app, where most of the biggies were on, or many of the biggies were actually online, and we were able to intercept a lot of those conversations. Now, online, those people were not having a discussion about where they were going for dinner. They were actually having discussions about where the drugs were going to be coming in, how they could pick up the drugs, where the guns were, where the weapons were. So it was a very transactional conversation between these pretty significant crims. What we've been able to do through the AFP and through the connections that they had internationally was start to take that down. So I think the figures are escalating on a daily basis, but there have been well over a couple of hundred charges that have already been laid here in Australia. That's rolling out internationally. That means that here in Australia there's less drugs on the street, and there will be for a time. There's less weapons that are going to be on our streets here. That's going to have an impact on our day-to-day lives. Now, people have asked about what the future is going to be. Part of the whole operation was to make sure that these criminals understood a little bit about what the capability was, and to make them increase their own awareness of how their conversations itself could be accessed. Now, I would say clearly that the AFP and the FBI have accessed those conversations for all of the right reasons, and over the coming weeks, months, and potentially years, that will play out in court.
Thank you very much. A very pertinent case study for all of us to think about. It's real and it's big, I think, is the message there. I'm going to now go to questions from our online participants and then a question from the floor. We've got a mic at the back of the room for those in the room here. But let me combine two questions. This one is for the Minister, but then I'm going to ask Keith for a perspective from the Commonwealth Bank, and you also, Michelle. It's about the critical infrastructure security legislation, and happily the questions that we have online give us both points of view. Why isn't the government being more assertive in fostering compliance with cybersecurity responsibilities and recommendations on the one hand, and on the other hand, is it right that the government is adopting an approach which would provide step-in rights in certain circumstances? So I think we've got both sides of the coin, and I'll ask the Minister perhaps to share with us the thinking about the critical infrastructure legislation.
Look, the critical infrastructure legislation is particularly important to us, and I think that what it demonstrates is people's perception of what is critical infrastructure, which is way beyond the physical bricks and mortar, is crucial to us. So you're actually starting to see critical infrastructure bring in things such as the banks, and I know that we'll hear some more deliberately about the banks, but it looks at water, it looks at electricity, it looks about what is really critical to us here in Australia. Now, we do know that there is an increasing threat of cyber attack here in Australia, ransomware, which we've just touched on. These are significant issues for us. It is also important that we recognise that many businesses who either have been subject to a ransomware attack or are likely to be subject to a ransomware attack are not necessarily being going to be forthcoming in providing that information. That could be for a number of reasons. They're concerned about the implications of it being well known that they have been subject to attack, that some of the data has been lost, that they're unable to recover that data. So there are risks associated there. What it means is that we have significant capability here in Australia through the likes of the Australian Signals Directorate. If we don't have the information going through to the Australian Signals Directorate that enables them to come in and provide a level of support, that it means that we can't assist in trying to re-establish some of the connections that are there to try and assist with recovering the data, but it also means that we're not getting the intelligence that we need that will lead to a more cyber secure environment for us here in Australia. So I would say that the critical infrastructure legislation that was introduced into the House now some time ago needs to be progressed as a matter of urgency, and that is what my plan is. I think it actually provides significantly more protections than it does introduce risks.
Keith, I wonder if you could give us the perspective perhaps of the banking sector rather than specifically the CommBank.
So I think, and I was delighted to hear the Minister say that cyber's top priority, which is great. I mean, we work very closely with Home Affairs, we work very closely with ACSC on such things as upcoming legislation, etc. And what I'll say about that is very clearly we're supportive of any legislation, but also other action that will increase the awareness, but also the posture of the community at large, including businesses. I think that is something that we will continue to, and we do have very good challenge conversations as well as we work through this. And I think it's a good example of industry, government coming together for the greater good. The only other thing I'd add there is that it can never just be a legislative kind of answer. And I think, as the Minister mentioned earlier on, there's a lot more money now being put into other things such as, well, how do we then go about the education piece? How do we then collaborate better on intelligence? How do we then collaborate better on response, etc.? So that's always the balance we're trying to, I think, achieve.
And I wonder, Michelle, if we could hear from you on this one.
Well, I think thanks, Rosemary. I think that the two questions being combined there absolutely goes to the heart of what this session is all about, balance. There is a balanced approach, and the Minister and Keith have both hinted at that. There's not just one silver bullet for this situation. The critical infrastructure legislation is one piece of a very large patchwork of things that we need to be doing as a nation to be able to protect right down to the individual level, while not restricting the sort of, the process of entrepreneurship and innovation, which happens inside government, can I say, just as much as it happens in industry. So, absolutely, wherever I'm going, people are sort of celebrating the fact that this legislation is occurring, principally because it does level the playing field across industries. It's one of those kind of instruments that can be seen as a bit of a balancing mechanism. I think that the government has done a good job of learning some lessons from the encryption legislation and has done extensive consultation of this legislation, sort of in spite of the comparatively short period of time that it has been running through, compared to other areas like the telecommunications sector security reforms and the notifiable data breach scheme and those kinds of things that have taken a lot longer than the critical infrastructure amendment. So I think what we have here is the opportunity, though, to make sure that for those industries that don't think they're part of critical infrastructure, to the Minister's point, there are so many things that are critical now to how we live our everyday lives that are cyber physical. We need to make sure that that education, to Keith's point, spreads out. And this is where the value chain comes into it, that those trusted information sharing networks that occur organically as well as in an orchestrated way to make sure that everyone is aware of this legislation, because at some point it's likely to hit upon either through a supply chain contracting situation or through any of the other pieces of legislation that organisations are now subject to. I think that there is a very neat marriage here between the critical infrastructure legislation and the foreign interference legislation. Organisations are starting to get curious about this. Now, many are a bit concerned. It's simply coming from a place of not knowing what the impacts are. And with some of these pieces of legislation, the impacts are overwhelmingly positive and really open up the opportunity to go global in a far more competitive way.
Thanks, Michelle. Now, have we got any questions in the room? If not, I've got an iPad full of questions and I'll keep going. Bright lights are getting in my way, but I'm seeing the microphone just walk across the room. So we'll just give ourselves a minute down the front here. Thank you.
Hi, it's John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review. Minister, I just happened to read, and I wasn't aware of this until a couple of minutes ago, but Tim Watts, the Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity, has apparently introduced a private members bill into Parliament to force companies or individuals to contact the Australian Cybersecurity Centre before making a ransomware payment to hackers. What do you think about that as a proposition?
Let me answer that generally. Yes, Tim Watts introduced a private members bill into the House earlier this week. But if I respond to that very generally, from the government's perspective, we actually would like businesses to reach out particularly to ACSC in the event that they have a ransomware attack or they have other threats. ACSC, as part of the Australian Signals Directorate, is very well placed to be able to support them, but they rely, in many instances, on businesses reporting or contacting them directly. I've already had some discussions about mandatory reporting of ransomware attacks. And my view at this stage is that there are a range of views about that. It's very mixed in the response. What I want to do over the coming weeks is to explore that much more fully. I certainly want to make sure that the likes of the ACSC have the opportunity to support businesses who have been the subject of ransomware attacks, to gather intelligence that they need as a result of those ransomware attacks. But we started the discussion today really talking about things such as awareness, and what I don't want to do is end up putting the cart before the horse, effectively, and moving directly to this is a mandatory reporting of ransomware when we haven't gone through the process of raising awareness of cybersecurity, raising awareness of ransomware, making sure that we have in place all of the right mechanisms to support businesses. So yes, I want to collect the intelligence, but I want to make sure that we're doing this in a sensible and rational way. But I'm open to exploring this. I am already exploring it.
Thank you, Minister. And I think we're up to our last question, which I'll take from the online community. And it's a very human question. So we'll go first to Keith and then to Michelle, I think, with this one. And the question is, how are you attracting people to cybersecurity who aren't just nerds, but humans who understand psychology?
Okay, I'll let you make a judgment on which one I am after we finished.
Dorothy Dixon, Keith.
Well, I'm not sure why I'm not being asked a human question.
I didn't know that. So I think it's very important. There's always conversations about cyber skill shortage, and that is true. But what we've got to be very thoughtful about is how do we possibly widen the funnel for recruitment, for example, of skills into organisations, whichever organisations they may be. And part of that is through, the education pipeline, and certainly CommBank and all the other banks do major work with UNSW and various other universities to build that pipeline. I think then it's also looking at career changes for people. It's not always necessary that you've had to have a background in IT. We've got philosophers, we've got humanities people. I think the capabilities that people display is actually the most important thing. So are they curious? Are they problem solvers? These kind of capabilities, and then you can teach the kind of tech skills part. We've often made the mistake in the past of going, okay, I need this kind of skill, and then I write down in the job description all of the possible skills, and then I say, okay, you need 5 years experience. Hardly anybody probably can meet that. So it's about what are the capabilities, what are just the key skills, and if you've got the capabilities, then people can certainly be trained into cyber. And lastly, cyber's quite a broad church as well. It's not just deep tech pieces. You need a good organizational change management function, for example, because we're not always the most popular people in the organization because we've got to look after the security, and sometimes that will have impacts, and therefore explaining why you're doing this is also very important. So it's quite a broad church as well.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think to be additive to what Keith has just said is to remember that every single job in the economy has a cyber component to it. That's not tomorrow, that is right now. So to bring the Minister into the conversation, her job clearly has a cyber security component to it. As does all of her colleagues, no matter which portfolio they're responsible for or if they're in opposition. Every single job in the economy today has a cyber component to it. And that is because everything we're doing as humans now is cyber physical. And so I think if we think about it in that way, and we think about the sort of the technology components to that really only being sort of 1/3 of the equation, and it absolutely is tech for good, let's think about it in those terms. It does mean that everyone does need to have that awareness, there's that word again, but also there's just huge opportunities. My goodness gracious, there are so many opportunities when you think about your career through that kind of lens. And it does not need to be scary. There are so many ways that people can upskill quite quickly around these kinds of issues and topics. And to go right back to something that Rosemary talked about at the very beginning around boardrooms, and the Minister touched on this as well, and she's going to be in those rooms on occasion herself, right down to primary school kids. And Keith and I have done quite a bit of work through a program that we co-funded to make sure that there is cybersecurity in the curriculum of all of our school classrooms nationally, and everything in between. I'd sort of give you this anecdote that the most incredible person that I've ever worked with in the cyber domain is a PhD in music. And when people kind of hear that, they're like, hang on a sec, you don't have a master's and 16 sort of, grad certificates in, international relations and computer engineering and all of those things. Why would a PhD in music be helpful for cybersecurity? Now, some of you would already be able to pick up on this, and Keith said it. It's the computational and critical thinking that's most important, and having curiosity. Music is all about patterns. It's pattern analysis. So those translatable skills, every job has a cybersecurity component to it. And of course, if we all recognise that and have the balance within that, we are going to absolutely be a force to be reckoned with in this world, because there are a lot of nations that are not thinking about it in this way. And the economic value that can come from that is just unimaginably large. It's just so huge. It's trillions of dollars worth of intrinsic value to our economic diversity as well as our productivity, if we think about it in these terms. So cyber is everything.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think I need to give the last word on this topic to the Minister, who has one of the largest cybersecurity workforces in the country, with Home Affairs, ASD, ACSC, etc., etc. The balance, Minister, between the cyber nerds and the humans
There's a role for both, quite frankly. Look, what we do know is that we are already in the midst of a significant skills shortage in this area. It's been there for a while, and every tech business in particular that I speak to talks to me about the difficulties that they are having in attracting and retaining appropriately qualified staff. That leads into the translation of skills with people that have the right core basic skills, how we can actually upskill them and retrain them into these areas. But I think we also have a fundamental problem which goes to the awareness of cyber that we have spoken about, and it goes to schools making sure that as they are providing advice to students, as they are educating the parents about what the jobs of the future are going to be, that cyber plays a part in that. And that means that a lot of work has to be done to demystify cyber so that it is part of our everyday language, so that mums and dads understand it, kids at school understand it, they understand the skill sets that are needed, but they understand what the opportunities may well be for them to use skills that they use every single day to make money in the future, and that parents see an opportunity in cyber for their kids to have long-term sustainable jobs.
Terrific. I need to wrap our panel up. We've unhappily gone just a few minutes over time, but we've got a tight and very full schedule. Let me just let you know the answer to our poll question, what has been the greatest driver of increased cyber literacy within organisations? The answer is a very human answer. The answer is lessons learned from increased digitisation and connectiveness. So with that, I'd like you to join me in thanking our three panel members, the Minister for Home Affairs, the Honourable Karen Andrews, Keith Howard, the Chief Information Security Officer at the Commonwealth Bank, and Michelle Price, the CEO of AustCyber. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And other questions away.